Hey gang, so we're back here with concept 30.2. Now that we know a little bit about the seeded vascular plants, what makes them unique, some of the characteristics that make them unique, let's go ahead and divide these seeded vascular plants into the two major categories that we're going to take a look at. One would be the gymnosperms, which we'll look at first, and then the angiosperms. Concept 30.2 says gymnosperms bear naked seeds typically on cones. Gymnosperms basically means naked seeds, seeds not enclosed within ovaries. So they're not enclosed in some sort of mature ovary, perhaps something that you might think of as a fruit, even though later we're going to find out that the word fruit, when we only think of it as, say, a banana or an apple, it actually covers a lot more than that. But gymnosperms don't have any sort of fruit. The seeds are not enclosed inside ovaries. The seeds are exposed on what we call sporophylls, which are modified leaves, heavily modified leaves that usually form cones called strobili. So even, for example, probably the most common example would be like a pine cone. That cone is actually a very modified version of a set of leaves, and we call that cone a strobili. Within those strobili, within the big pine cones that you see, that would be where the seeds are located. That would be the female portion of the tree. Angiosperm seeds are found in fruits, which are mature ovaries. So we're going to look first at the gymnosperms, which don't have fruits, so their seeds are not found inside mature ovaries. They are naked, as how they're described here. If we look at our simplified reading or tree, it looks something like this. First we talked about the non-vascular plants, the bryophytes like the mosses and the like. Then we talked about the seedless vascular plants such as, say, a fern. And now we're on to the seeded vascular plants. We're going to start here with the gymnosperms, and then we'll finish up with the angiosperms. So starting with the basics of gymnosperm evolution, perhaps where we have the first evidence of the gymnosperms. Fossil evidence reveals that by the late Devonian period, which would be about 380 million years ago, some plants called pro-gymnosperms, which would be like the beginnings of gymnosperms, had begun to acquire some adaptations that characterize seed plants. For example, we have some fossil evidence of this particular tree here, Archaeopteris. Archaeopteris is a pro-gymnosperm. It's very similar to what we would consider a modern gymnosperm, but it didn't have all of the traits. It was heterosporous, which means it produced both separate male and female spores that went on to produce separate male and female gametes. And it had a woody stem. It was a tree-like plant with a woody stem, but it did not bear seeds. So it was almost like the gymnosperms that we have today, but not quite. So we call that a pro-gymnosperm, and this would have been about 380 million years ago. As I mentioned earlier, the basic living seed plants we have now can be divided into two clades called gymnosperms and angiosperms. The gymnosperms, the ones we'll look at first appeared in the early fossil record about 305 million years ago, and then actually dominated for a large portion of the Mesozoic era, 251 to 65 million years ago, dominated the terrestrial ecosystem. They were the dominant land plant at that time. Gymnosperms are still around today. They were better suited than non-vascular plants for the drier conditions of the terrestrial landscape. They had seeds, they produced pollen, they had thick cuticles on their leaves, relatively small surface area of needle-shaped leaves. All of these allow for the plant to be better suited for the drier conditions inland, where, say, for example, a moss or some of the other non-vascular plants that we talked about could not live in these drier conditions, primarily because they have to have the moisture for reproduction to occur. But these gymnosperms had all these various adaptations that allowed them to survive further inland, away from the water, in drier conditions. The angiosperms that we're going to talk about next began to replace the gymnosperms near the end of the Mesozoic era, about the same time that the vast majority of the dinosaurs began dying out. So this was a transition period that also marked the end of the reign of the dinosaurs. And nowadays, angiosperms dominate the terrestrial ecosystems. There's far more angiosperms plants around you than there are gymnosperms. Today, cone-bearing gymnosperms, called conifers, still do dominate certain parts of our ecosystems. They particularly dominate in the northern latitudes, such as, say, northern North America, Canada. Think of the taiga in Russia, Siberia, places like that. So spruce, fir, pine, redwoods. There are still vast areas of our world that are dominated by gymnosperms, but they tend to be more northern latitudes. The modern gymnosperms consist of 4 phyla. We're going to look at each of them briefly. I wouldn't necessarily ask that you have all of this information memorized, but just to look at the 4 phyla examples of the modern gymnosperms, the main one you're going to be familiar with is the last one, the Conifera phyta, and we'll spend most of our time talking about those, but there are 3 others as well. There's the Cicada phyta, which would be the cycads, the Ginkgo phyta, which there is only one living species of that particular phyla around now, called the Ginkgo biloba. Perhaps you've heard of that tree. The Nettophyta, which has 3 genera, and the Conifera phyta, which would be the one that you're probably most familiar with. That would be the conifers, such as your pine, your fir, and your redwoods. Of the 10 plant phyla in the taxonomic scheme that is adopted by this textbook, 4 of those 10 phyla are the gymnosperms that you see listed here. The exact relationship amongst these 4 phyla is still a little uncertain, so the exact evolutionary path that nature took to get to these 4 phyla is not quite clarified yet, and that's something that scientists are still working on. But this would be 4 of the 10 plant phyla in our taxonomic scheme that this textbook adopts. So we're going to take a look at each of these briefly. If you want to see some really cool pictures and photos and information, some of the information I'm going to show you in just a moment, you can look on page 622 and 623 of your textbook. They've got a nice double-page layout of these 4 phyla of the gymnosperms. The first phylum we're going to look at briefly is the Cycadophyta, or it might be pronounced Cycadophyta. Not sure on that one. Cycadophyta or Cycadophyta. Individuals have large cones and palm-like leaves, and these thrive during the Mesozoic. So these would have been around particularly during the later stages of the dinosaur times, but relatively few species exist today. Not too common in our world today, but here's one that you see below in the picture here, the Cycas revoluta, or revolata. Not really sure how to pronounce that. Pretty cool looking plant, but it is a type of gymnosperm, and you can see the cone here, which would be a heavily modified leaf that contains the seeds. The second of the 4 phylum we're going to look at is the phylum Ginkgophyta. This phylum consists of only a single living species called the Ginkgo biloba, and you've perhaps heard of this one before. You could call this particular plant sort of like a living fossil, because there are fossils that look very, very similar to the modern day ginkgo that we have today. So the ginkgo is recognizable in fossils of its ancient relatives dating back 270 million years ago. It doesn't mean that the plant has not undergone evolution over time. It certainly has, but sometimes evolution works in stops and starts and fits, and so you can have creatures such as, say for example, a crocodile, which looks very similar to its ancient relatives did millions of years ago. This would be a plant version of that, where the modern version still looks very similar to the ancient relative from millions of years ago. The Ginkgo biloba has a high tolerance to air pollution and poor conditions, and so it makes it for an extremely popular ornamental tree, especially in cityscapes and urban areas. So it's a very interesting type of tree. Let me show you a picture. There's a Ginkgo biloba. They oftentimes use just the male versions, just the pollen-producing trees, because the Ginkgo biloba does produce a type of sort of a fleshy seed that tends to kind of smell bad when it begins to decay and rot. So a lot of times they won't use the female version of the tree in landscapes. They'll just use the male version. But that's what the Ginkgo biloba looks like. And just to back up and tell you how tough and hardy these plants can be, some extreme examples of ginkgo tenacity can be seen in Hiroshima, Japan. If you'll recall from your history books, Hiroshima is where we dropped one of the nuclear bombs to end World War II. There were 6 trees, ginkgo bilobas, that were growing between about 1 to 2 kilometers from the 1945 atom bomb explosion that pretty much leveled everything in the area. There were very few living things within 1 to 2 kilometers of the bomb explosion, and pretty much all other plants and animals were wiped out. But these 6 ginkgo biloba trees, although they were very heavily damaged and burned and charred, they actually survived and were soon healthy, and they are still alive to this day. So there are 6 trees in the Hiroshima area that actually survived the atomic blast of 1945. So that's a pretty tough tree, tough living creature there. The third phylum of gymnosperms we're going to take a look at are the Nettophyta. The Nettophyta is a varied looking set of plants. The phylum comprises 3 genera, and These plants don't really look much alike. They vary quite a bit in appearance. Some of them are tropical, others live in the desert, and really the way they were grouped together in this phylum was based on molecular data, because if you looked at these different plants that belong to this phylum, you wouldn't necessarily think that they belong together, but based on genetic and molecular data, they are very closely related. One of them is this plant right here. This plant is called ephedra, and you may kind of recognize that word. Ephedra is used to make a particular compound called ephedrine, which is used in as a decongestant. Like if you have a stuffy nose or something like that, you may take a medication that contains ephedrine. Well, that is a compound that can be distilled or taken from this plant called ephedra. So that is the third phylum, Gnetophyta. Let's take a look at the fourth phylum, the one that you're probably most familiar with. That would be the conifers. The phylum Coniferophyta or Coniferophyta is by far the largest of the gymnosperm phyla. You're probably familiar with more of these than the others. These are conifers that are evergreens. A lot of them carry out photosynthesis all year long. Some of them do drop some of their leaves or needles in the fall, but many of them stay green pretty much throughout the year. So some of these you're probably familiar with. We have things like the Douglas fir and the European larch, which the larch actually does drop the majority of its needles and leaves in the fall. Then others are more evergreens like the juniper. Here's a giant sequoia tree, a bristlecone pine. This is a pretty fascinating group of plants. For example, in this group you have some of the largest and oldest living things ever on Earth. In the giant sequoias and the redwoods, you have some of the largest living creatures that have ever lived on the planet. And you have, for example, some of the oldest living creatures that have ever lived on the planet as well. There's a bristlecone pine in the California area called Methuselah, and they actually won't even tell you exactly where this bristlecone pine is because they want to make sure it's protected and not vandalized. But Methuselah, as the pine is nicknamed, is a 4,845-year-old Great Basin bristlecone pine growing somewhere in the White Mountains of Inyo County in eastern California. For many years it was described or thought to be the oldest known living non-clonal organism, but they've actually since found another bristlecone pine in 2013 that was slightly older, and it's about 5,064 years old. So this is a fascinating group of plants, this particular phylum, the conifers, including some of the largest ever living creatures and some of the oldest living creatures. So let's kind of zoom in on some of these gymnosperms. We'll probably use the conifers as our example plant because we're going to be more familiar with those. There are basically three key features of the gymnosperm life cycle that sets it apart from, say, the angiosperm. So let's take a closer look. First is the dominance of the sporophyte generation. You're going to find that, like most of the other plants we're going to discuss, the sporophyte diploid generation is going to be the main part of its life, the main part that you see. The development of seeds from fertilized ovules, so we are talking about seeded plants, so we'll have to discuss how those seeds form. And then the transfer of sperm to ovules by pollen. So unlike some of the non-vascular plants we've discussed where the sperm is flagellated and kind of swims like a mammalian sperm does, these plants are transferring their sperm via pollen grains that usually float in the wind or get blown by the air or carried by other creatures, animals, and the like. It should possibly be bees or hummingbirds, or it could even be carried by brushing of animals against their fur and that type of thing. So we're going to use the life cycle of a pine as an example of this entire life cycle of a gymnosperm. As usual, your text provides some good short little animation clips, so if you're watching the PowerPoint you can right click on this slide and hit play, and this will give you a basic overview using a pine tree as an example of the gymnosperm life cycle. As we already mentioned, the pine tree that you see is the sporophyte of the plant, the diploid portion of the plant. So the pine tree is a sporophyte, and it produces sporangia in male and female cones. So these would be separate structures in slightly different parts of the plant. And what you usually think of, say for example when you think of a pine cone, is the female portion that you're talking about, the macrospore, the macro sporangia. And the male portion of the pine cone, you've probably seen it before, but you might need to be shown a picture of what it looks like. It's slightly smaller, actually quite a bit smaller than the large female pine cone that you're probably used to seeing. The large pine cone again is the female but these sporangia are produced in different male and female versions in different spots on the plant. The small cones produce the microspores called pollen grains, each of which contains a male gametophyte. And then again, the familiar larger cones contain the ovules, which produce megaspores that develop into the female gametophytes. And it takes nearly 3 years from cone production to mature seeds. So this is a fairly lengthy process, the actual creation of that pine cone, and then it grows larger and larger until eventually it is the site of seed production. The textbook does a good job of kind of stepping you through with some illustrations. Again, the haploid, which would be the gametophyte portion, is going to be in blue, and the diploid is going to be in pink. That would be the sporophyte portion. So the tree itself is a mature sporophyte. It's in the diploid stage. But on that tree there are male and female cones. And within these male and female cones, the microsporangia, they produce either male or female gametophytes, which produce the pollen or the seed eventually. So here we have the male portion. So this would be the male cone. It's slightly smaller and differently shaped. Inside that male cone, the microsporangia produce pollen grains, and the pollen grains are the haploid portion of the plant's life cycle. Then on another portion of the plant we have what we would usually consider a pine cone, which you usually think of. That is the larger female, the ovulate cone. Inside are the ovules. This would be the megasporangium, and that's going to produce the megaspore inside of this portion, and that stays inside the cone. That does not leave the sporophyte part of the plant. So when we have fertilization occur, we have a pollen tube that goes into this area here, into the female gametophyte, and so you have the sperm and the egg nucleus combined, and that's where you have fertilization. And so then that becomes a seed, eventually becomes an embryo. So now we're back to a diploid stage. We have an embryo inside, you have food reserves surrounding that, and then usually a fairly tough seed coat. In pine trees and a lot of different types of trees, the seeds actually have these little fibrous sort of wings, so that when the seeds do fall out of the pine cone, they tend to kind of flutter and float and spin like a helicopter. Kind of helps move the seeds away from the parent plants. If the seeds are lucky enough to land in a suitable spot, the seedling will begin to grow, and that completes the life cycle on around again. So let's take a quick break right there. These are the seeds that we would call naked. In other words, they're not enclosed by any sort of fruit. These would be your gymnosperms. And again, of the gymnosperms, probably the conifers are the best well known. So next we're going to take a look at the other type of seeded plant called the angiosperm, and that's going to be all the plants that produce seeds that are enclosed in some form of fruit. They also produce flowers and fruit. But we're going to find out that what you think of as flowers and fruit, there's a wide variety of those, and they may not exactly match what you have in your mind's eye. So let's take a quick break with the gymnosperms, and we'll come right back.